The salt spray whipped across the deck of the USS Wasp as Admiral Sarah Chen stood gripping the bridge railing, her knuckles white against the metal. Through the chaos of 40-knot winds and 12-foot swells, she watched something that defied every piece of naval aviation wisdom she'd learned in her 30-year career. Lieutenant Commander Maria Vasquez was attempting what seasoned pilots called suicide, landing an F-35B Lightning II on a moving destroyer in conditions that would ground most aircraft. "This is impossible," Admiral Chen muttered into her headset, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. But impossible was about to become reality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins 3 days earlier in the crystal-clear waters of the Philippine Sea. The USS Wasp, America's newest amphibious assault ship, was conducting joint training exercises with Allied forces when the unthinkable happened. A massive storm system, later designated Typhoon Omega, had suddenly intensified and changed course, trapping the fleet in its path. But this wasn't just any storm. Satellite imagery showed sustained winds of over 120 miles per hour, with wave heights reaching 30 feet. Most of the fleet had already retreated to safer waters, but the USS Wasp couldn't abandon its mission. Somewhere in those churning seas, a downed reconnaissance aircraft held critical intelligence that could prevent an international incident. The pilot had managed to transmit his coordinates before going silent, but his position was deteriorating rapidly. Every minute counted. Lieutenant Commander Maria Vasquez had been flying F-35Bs for 7 years, longer than most pilots had even seen the revolutionary aircraft. She was part of the first generation to master its vertical landing capabilities, a technology that seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. The F-35B wasn't just a fighter jet, it was a transformer, capable of conventional takeoff and landing like a traditional aircraft, but also able to hover and land vertically like a helicopter. This dual capability made it perfect for operations from smaller ships and confined spaces. But what Vasquez was about to attempt had never been done before. Not in these conditions, not on a ship this size. The USS Wasp, while impressive at 844 feet long, was not an aircraft carrier. Unlike the massive supercarriers with their stable flight decks and sophisticated landing systems, the Wasp was designed for amphibious operations. Its flight deck was shorter, narrower, and far less stable in heavy seas. Even in calm conditions, landing an F-35 on the Wasp required exceptional skill. In 40-knot winds, with the ship pitching and rolling like a cork in a bathtub, it was beyond dangerous. It was theoretically impossible. The mathematics alone were staggering. A typical carrier landing involves the aircraft approaching at around 150 knots, with the carrier steaming into the wind at about 30 knots, creating a relative wind speed of 180 knots across the deck. But the Wasp, fighting against 40-knot winds and massive swells, was experiencing deck movements of plus or minus 30 feet vertically and rolling up to 20 degrees port and starboard. The landing zone wasn't just moving, it was dancing a violent, unpredictable waltz with the ocean. Vasquez had launched from the Wasp 6 hours earlier in relatively calm conditions, part of a 2-aircraft search mission. Her wingman, Captain Rodriguez, had been forced to divert to a land base in Okinawa when his aircraft developed hydraulic problems. Now, she was alone, running low on fuel, with nowhere to go but down. The fuel situation was critical. The F-35B, for all its technological marvels, was thirsty. In combat configuration, it carried just over 13,000 pounds of fuel, giving it a combat radius of about 450 nautical miles. Vasquez had been airborne for nearly 5 hours, conducting search patterns in increasingly difficult conditions. Her fuel gauges showed less than 2,000 pounds remaining, barely enough for one landing attempt. Admiral Chen's voice crackled through the radio. "Lightning II, this is Wasp Actual. I'm ordering you to divert to Kadena Air Base. We'll figure out another way too." Negative, Admiral, Vasquez's voice cut through the static, calm and professional despite the chaos around her. Cadena is reporting 0-0 conditions. I'd never make it through this weather. Besides, we have a pilot down there who's counting on us. The Admiral closed her eyes, knowing Vasquez was right. The storm had closed every airfield within her remaining fuel range. The weather reports painted a grim picture. Typhoon Omega was a monster, covering nearly 1,000 square miles with its destructive winds and rain. Commercial flights had been grounded, military bases had secured their aircraft, and even the most experienced pilots were staying on the ground. But Maria Vasquez wasn't most pilots. She had grown up in a family of aviators. Her father had flown F-14 Tomcats off carriers in the 1990s. Her brother was a Blue Angels pilot, and her sister commanded a squadron of Super Hornets. Aviation wasn't just her career, it was in her DNA. She understood the delicate dance between machine and physics, the precise calculations of thrust and lift, drag and weight that kept 30,000 pounds of metal and fuel aloft. More importantly, she understood the F-35B like few others did.
The F-35B Lightning II was a technological marvel 20 years in the making, representing the pinnacle of American aerospace engineering. Unlike its conventional siblings, the F-35A and F-35C, the B variant incorporated the revolutionary Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine with its unique three-bearing swivel module. This engineering masterpiece allowed the main engine exhaust to redirect 90 degrees downward, while two smaller lift fans, one behind the cockpit and two roll posts under the wings, provided additional vertical thrust. The system could generate over 40,000 pounds of vertical thrust, enough to lift the aircraft straight up or allow it to hover like a $30 million hummingbird. But the complexity of the system also made it incredibly demanding to fly. Pilots often described vertical landing mode as flying 4 different aircraft simultaneously, each requiring constant attention and microsecond precise adjustments. Vasquez had mastered this complexity through thousands of hours of training and real-world experience. She had landed F-35Bs on ships in heavy seas before, but never in conditions like this. The difference between challenging and impossible often came down to a few knots of wind speed, a few degrees of deck angle, or a few seconds of timing.
Lightning II-7, be advised, deck conditions are deteriorating, came the voice of Air Boss Commander Thompson from the Wasp's control tower. We're seeing sustained winds of 42 knots, gusting to 55 knots. Deck is moving plus minus 28 feet vertical, rolling 15 degrees port and starboard. RSD recommends you wave off and attempt emergency landing at Thompson, there is no emergency field, Vasquez interrupted, her voice steady despite the turbulence battering her aircraft. Every runway within 500 miles is closed. This is it. She was right, and everyone on the ship knew it. The rapid decision display in the ship's Combat Information Center painted a stark picture. The storm had consumed everything in its path, turning the Western Pacific into an aerial graveyard. Commercial flights had been diverted hundreds of miles around the storm system, and even military aircraft were staying firmly on the ground. But Vasquez wasn't just fighting the weather, she was fighting physics itself. In normal conditions, the F-35B's approach to a ship followed a carefully choreographed sequence. The pilot would begin the transition from conventional flight to hover mode at about 3 miles out, gradually slowing the aircraft while simultaneously bringing the massive engine thrust from horizontal to vertical orientation. The transition took nearly 2 minutes and required the aircraft to pass through what pilots called the commitment zone, a phase of flight where the aircraft was neither fish nor fowl, too slow to fly conventionally, but not yet stable in hover mode. In perfect conditions, this transition was challenging. In 40-knot winds, with the landing platform gyrating like a mechanical bull, it was a high-wire act without a net. The physics were unforgiving.
As Vasquez transitioned to hover mode, the aircraft became increasingly vulnerable to wind gusts. A sudden crosswind could push her sideways into the ship's superstructure. A downdraft could slam her into the deck. An updraft could lift her beyond the hover ceiling, where the engines couldn't maintain stable flight. Each of these scenarios had only one outcome. "Our memories to request permission for emergency approach," Vasquez's voice came through the radio, professional and calm. Admiral Chen looked at the weather display, then at the fuel readings being transmitted from Vasquez's aircraft. Less than 1,500 pounds of fuel remaining. At this consumption rate, she had maybe 10 minutes of flight time left. "Maria," the Admiral said, using her first name, a breach of protocol that spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. "I can't authorize this. The risk is too high. There has to be another way." "Admiral, with respect, there is no other way. That pilot down there, Lieutenant Morrison from the recon flight, his emergency beacon is still transmitting. The search and rescue coordinators estimate he has maybe 6 hours before hypothermia sets in. If I don't land now, get refueled, and get back out there, he dies." The Admiral closed her eyes. Lieutenant Morrison was 24 years old, fresh out of flight school, with a wife and newborn daughter back in San Diego. He had been flying a routine reconnaissance mission when his aircraft suffered a catastrophic engine failure, forcing him to eject into the churning seas. His survival depended on rescue within the next few hours, but no rescue aircraft could operate in these conditions except the F-35B, and only if it could land, refuel, and launch again. The moral calculus was brutal. Authorize the landing attempt, and she might lose both Vasquez and Morrison. Refuse, and Morrison was certainly dead. "Lightning II-7, you are cleared for emergency approach," Admiral Chen transmitted. "God help us all." The bridge fell silent, except for the howling wind and the rhythmic crash of waves against the ship's hull. Every person on the Wasp understood what they were about to witness. This wasn't just a landing, it was a test of human skill against the raw power of nature, of technology against physics, of determination against impossible odds. Vasquez began her approach checklist, her voice steady and professional as she communicated with the ship's air traffic control. But inside her helmet, her heart was racing. She had studied every aspect of F-35B vertical landing procedures, had practiced emergency approaches in simulators countless times, but this was uncharted territory. The aircraft began its descent through the storm, buffeted by winds that would have grounded any other aircraft. Rain struck the canopy like bullets, visibility dropped to near zero, and the Wasp's flight deck appeared and disappeared through the chaos like a mirage. What happened next would change naval aviation forever.
3 miles from the USS Wasp, Lieutenant Commander Vasquez began the most complex aerial maneuver of her career. The F-35B was still in conventional flight mode, wings level, engines providing forward thrust, but that was about to change dramatically. "Wasp Tower, Lightning II-7 beginning transition to hover mode," she transmitted, her voice cutting through the radio static. "Roger, Lightning II-7. Winds now 4-5 knots, gusting to 6-0. Deck pitching plus/minus 32 feet. The numbers were getting worse, but there was no turning back now. Vasquez's hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced precision, but her movements carried the weight of years of training. The transition from conventional flight to short takeoff vertical landing mode was the F-35B's party trick, but it was also its most dangerous phase of flight. She had to slow the aircraft from over 200 knots to essentially zero forward speed, while simultaneously reconfiguring the entire propulsion system. The process began with the nozzle rotation. Behind her, the massive exhaust nozzle of the F-135 engine began its 90-degree downward rotation. The sound inside the cockpit changed from the familiar roar of horizontal flight to a deeper, more ominous rumble. 20,000 pounds of thrust that had been pushing her forward was now transitioning to push her up. Simultaneously, the lift fan behind her seat spun up to full power. This wasn't a gentle transition. The fan accelerated to over 10,000 RPM in seconds, creating a massive column of downward-directed air. The two roll posts under the wings also activated, providing additional stability and control authority. But the real challenge wasn't mechanical, it was environmental. The storm wasn't just wind and rain, it was a three-dimensional battlefield of air currents, pressure changes, and chaotic atmospheric conditions. As Vasquez slowed the aircraft, it became increasingly vulnerable to every gust, every pressure wave, every atmospheric disturbance. The F-35B in hover mode was like trying to balance a bowling ball on a broomstick while riding a roller coaster. Lightning II, we're painting you at 2 miles, altitude 800 feet, came the voice of the approach controller. Recommend descent to approach altitude. Roger, beginning descent. Vasquez eased the throttle back slightly, allowing the aircraft to descend through the turbulent air. The ride was incredibly rough. The aircraft was bouncing and shaking like a paint mixer. Every few seconds, a particularly violent gust would jolt the F-35B sideways or up and down. Each time, Vasquez had to make rapid control inputs to maintain stability. The fuel situation was becoming critical. The digital display showed less than 1,000 pounds remaining. In hover mode, the F-35B consumed fuel at nearly 3 times the rate of conventional flight. She had maybe 5 minutes of hovering time, and that was optimistic. Through the rain-lashed canopy, she caught her first glimpse of the Wasp. The ship looked like a toy boat in a bathtub being shaken by an angry child. The flight deck was rising and falling through a 30-foot range every few seconds, and the entire ship was rolling back and forth through an arc that would have made seasoned sailors sick. "Jesus," she whispered, then immediately keyed the radio. "Wasp Tower, visual contact with the ship. Conditions look challenging." That was the understatement of the year. Admiral Chen, watching from the bridge, could see the aircraft through the storm. It appeared as a dark shape against the gray sky, occasionally disappearing completely behind walls of rain and spray. Even at this distance, she could see the aircraft was fighting for every foot of controlled flight. "All hands, this is the Admiral," Chen announced over the ship's intercom. "We have an aircraft conducting emergency recovery operations. All non-essential personnel clear the weather decks immediately. Flight deck crew to emergency stations." On the flight deck, the landing team was taking extraordinary measures. Normally, landing operations involved a crew of about a dozen specialists, aircraft directors, safety observers, firefighters, and maintenance personnel. But these weren't normal conditions. Anyone not absolutely essential had been ordered below decks. Only 6 people remained topside, all wearing safety harnesses and connected to the ship by steel cables. The landing signal officer, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, stood at his station near the superstructure, rain streaming off his helmet. His job was to guide the aircraft during the critical final moments of approach. But in these conditions, his normal visual cues were almost useless. The F-35B would appear and disappear through the rain and spray like a ghost. "Lightning II, 1 mile out, cleared for approach. Winds 48 knots. Steady. Deck is active." Vasquez could now see the flight deck clearly through brief breaks in the weather. What she saw made her stomach tighten. The deck wasn't just moving, it was performing a complex 3-dimensional dance that changed every few seconds. Up, down, left, right, tilting forward, tilting back. There was no pattern, no rhythm she could anticipate. Landing on an aircraft carrier was often compared to hitting a postage stamp with a dart, while both the dart thrower and the postage stamp were on moving trains. But this was more like hitting a postage stamp that was attached to a ping-pong ball bouncing around inside a washing machine during the spin cycle. The approach required split-second timing. She would have to judge not just where the deck was at any given moment, but where it would be 2 or 3 seconds in the future when her aircraft reached that point in space. It was 3-dimensional chess, played at 100 miles per hour in a hurricane. Half mile out, beginning final approach configuration. The moment of truth had arrived. At half a mile out, Lieutenant Commander Vasquez made the final transition to full hover mode. The F-35B was now flying like no other fighter aircraft in the world, suspended in mid-air by pure thrust, balanced on columns of superheated exhaust and fan-generated downwash. The transformation was complete. She was no longer flying a conventional aircraft, but rather piloting a controlled explosion that happened to have wings. The physics of hover flight are fundamentally different from conventional flight. In normal flight, the wings generate lift by moving through the air, creating pressure differentials that keep the aircraft aloft. But in hover mode, the wings are essentially useless. All lift comes from the engines pushing air straight down. This makes the aircraft incredibly responsive to pilot inputs, but also exponentially more difficult to control. Every tiny movement of the throttle translated to immediate vertical motion. A slight adjustment of the control stick resulted in lateral movement. The aircraft wanted to dance in the air, and in these conditions, that dance was becoming increasingly violent. Lightning II weather update, winds now 50 knots, gusting to 65. We're tracking a particularly strong cell passing over the ship in approximately 2 minutes. Vasquez felt her heart skip. She was committed now, too low on fuel to go anywhere else, too close to the ship to safely abort. She had to land in the next few minutes or accept the fact that both she and Lieutenant Morrison would be lost. Through the rain and spray, she could see the flight deck personnel. They looked like ants from her altitude. Tiny figures in bright-colored vests struggling against the wind and rain. She knew each of them was risking their lives just being on deck in these conditions. One wrong step, one moment of inattention, and the 60-knot winds could throw a person overboard like a piece of paper. The approach profile for a vertical landing was unlike anything in conventional aviation. Rather than the steady, controlled descent of a normal aircraft landing, the F-35B had to essentially feel its way down through the air, constantly adjusting power and attitude to maintain position over the rapidly moving target. Vasquez's eyes darted between her instruments and the ship below. The radar altimeter showed her height above the water, but that number was constantly changing as the waves rose and fell beneath her. More useful was the laser rangefinder system that could track the distance to the ship's deck. But even that was giving erratic readings as spray and rain interfered with the laser beams. 400 feet, looking good, came the voice of Chief Rodriguez, the landing signal officer. Deck moving plus minus 25 feet, rolling 12 degrees left and right. She could see it now, the violent motion of the flight deck. Every few seconds, the entire landing area would rise up toward her or drop away, sometimes by 30 feet or more. It was like trying to land on an elevator that was being operated by someone having a seizure. But Vasquez had trained for this. Not exactly this. No one had ever trained for conditions quite this extreme, but she understood the principles. The key was not to fight the ship's motion, but to work with it, to time her descent to match the ship's movements rather than oppose them. The fuel warning light flickered on in her cockpit, less than 600 pounds remaining. At current consumption rates, she had maybe 3 minutes of flight time left. Lightning II recommend immediate landing, fuel state critical. Copy tower, beginning final descent. This was the moment where theory met reality, where years of training and thousands of hours of flight experience would either save her life or fail catastrophically. Vasquez eased the throttle forward slightly, adding power to arrest her descent rate. The F-35B responded immediately, checking its downward motion. But as she adjusted power, a massive gust of wind caught the aircraft from the side. The F-35B lurched 20 feet to the left, almost directly over the ship's superstructure. Vasquez instantly corrected, adding power to the right side roll post while simultaneously adjusting the main engine thrust vector. "Whoa!" Chief Rodriguez's voice cracked through the radio. "Lightning 27, you're drifting left. Drift left." Vasquez was already correcting, but the wind was relentless. Every time she stabilized the aircraft, another gust would push her off course. The F-35B was dancing in the air like a leaf in a tornado, requiring constant, minute adjustments to maintain any semblance of controlled flight. 200 feet, still drifting left, Rodriguez called. The ship's motion was becoming more violent as she descended. From altitude, the landing area movements had looked manageable, but now at 200 feet, the reality was terrifying. The landing area wasn't just moving, it was thrashing like a wounded animal, rising and falling through an arc that seemed impossible for a ship to survive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 150 feet, coming right, looking better. She had found the rhythm. She was no longer trying to maintain a fixed position over the deck, but rather matching the ship's chaotic dance. When the deck rose, she climbed slightly. When it fell, she descended. When it rolled left, she drifted left with it. It was like learning to dance with a partner who was having a seizure, but gradually she was finding the pattern within the chaos. The key insight was that the ship's motion, while violent, wasn't entirely random. Ocean swells have a rhythm, and experienced sailors can feel it. The ship was responding to that rhythm, rising and falling with the waves, rolling with the wind and current. Vasquez began to feel that rhythm too, transmitted through her aircraft sensors and her own inner ear. 100 feet, on center line, looking good. She was so close now that she could see individual crew members on the flight deck. Chief Rodriguez stood at his station, arms outstretched, guiding her down through hand signals that were barely visible through the rain and spray. The crash and rescue crew stood ready with their foam trucks, knowing that even the smallest mistake would result in catastrophic fire.
50 feet, power looking good, come down easy. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez could now see every detail of the flight deck beneath her. The steel was slick with spray and rain, reflecting the aircraft's lights like a dark mirror. Yellow deck markings, normally bright and clear, were barely visible through the water streaming across the surface. This wasn't just a challenging landing. This was a test of whether human skill and advanced technology could overcome the raw power of nature. The F-35B was now fully configured for vertical landing, but the aircraft was fighting her every second. In hover mode, the Lightning II was essentially an unstable platform kept aloft by brute force. The fly-by-wire flight control system was working overtime, making hundreds of tiny adjustments every second to keep the aircraft from tumbling out of control. But even the most sophisticated computer system had its limits, and they were reaching those limits now. 30 feet, looking good, but be ready for the next wave set. Chief Rodriguez could see what Vasquez couldn't, the radar display showing the approaching wave pattern. A massive set of swells was bearing down on the ship, waves that would throw the deck through an even more violent motion in the next 30 seconds. She had to get the aircraft on deck before those waves arrived, or the opportunity would be lost. Vasquez felt the aircraft shudder as she descended through the turbulent air directly above the ship. The closer she got to the deck, the more chaotic the airflow became. The ship's superstructure was creating wind shadows and turbulent eddies that grabbed the F-35B like invisible hands. Hot exhaust gases from the aircraft's engines were mixing with the cold sea air, creating additional turbulence that fed back into the aircraft's control systems. 20 feet, drift right slightly, coming down. At 20 feet, the ground effect began to take hold. The massive downwash from the F-35B's engines was hitting the deck and bouncing back up, creating a cushion of compressed air beneath the aircraft. This normally helped stabilize the aircraft during landing, but on a moving deck in high winds, it created its own problems. The reflected air was being caught by the wind and blown sideways, creating lateral forces that tried to push the aircraft off the landing spot. 15 feet. Looking perfect. Bring her down easy. Vasquez could see the landing spot directly beneath her, a small rectangle marked in white paint on the steel deck. In normal conditions, it would look huge from this distance, but with the deck pitching and rolling, rising and falling, the target seemed impossibly small. She was trying to thread a needle while both she and the needle were on different roller coasters. The fuel warning light was now flashing urgently. Less than 300 pounds remained. If she had to wave off and go around for another attempt, she wouldn't have enough fuel to make it. This was it. Land now or accept that both she and Lieutenant Morrison would be lost. 10 feet. Hold what you've got. This was the critical moment. At 10 feet, she was committed. Too low to safely abort, too high to survive a power failure. The aircraft was balanced on the edge of controlled flight and controlled crash. Every pilot who had ever attempted a vertical landing knew this moment, when skill, training, and luck would either combine to save the day or fail spectacularly. The ship chose that moment to encounter the massive wave set that Chief Rodriguez had been tracking. The USS Wasp's bow rose suddenly, climbing what felt like a mountain of water. The entire ship tilted upward at an angle that seemed impossible for a vessel that size. Then, just as suddenly, the bow crashed down into the trough behind the wave, sending the stern soaring upward. The landing deck didn't just move, it disappeared and reappeared in a completely different location. "Wave off! Wave off!" Rodriguez shouted into his radio. "Deck motion too extreme." But Vasquez was already committed. With less than 300 pounds of fuel, there was nowhere to go. She had to ride out the ship's violent motion and hope that training and instinct would be enough to get her safely on deck. The F-35B dropped with the ship's deck, falling nearly 20 feet in 2 seconds. Vasquez's stomach lurched as she experienced momentary weightlessness, the aircraft essentially in free fall. She immediately added power, but the engines needed time to respond. For a terrifying moment, she was falling faster than the ship was dropping away beneath her. Then the ship's motion reversed. The deck came rushing back up toward her at tremendous speed. She had seconds to arrest her descent rate before the 30,000-pound aircraft would smash into the steel deck with the force of a small bomb. "Pull power! Pull power!" Rodriguez screamed into his radio. Vasquez was already ahead of him, hauling back on the throttle and simultaneously adjusting the thrust vector controls. The F-35B's engines roared to life, creating a column of superheated air that pushed back against the approaching deck. The aircraft's descent slowed, but it was going to be close, very close. The mathematical precision required was staggering. She had to calculate not just her current rate of descent and the ship's rate of rise, but also factor in the time delay for engine response, the effects of ground cushion, the lateral forces from the wind, and a dozen other variables. All while flying an unstable aircraft in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced test pilot. At 5 feet above the deck, traveling downward at nearly 10 feet per second, with the deck rising to meet her at almost the same rate, Lieutenant Commander Maria Vasquez made the final control inputs that would either save her life or end it.
Time seemed to slow as the F-35B Lightning II and the USS Wasp's flight deck converged in a collision that would either be remembered as one of the greatest achievements in naval aviation history or one of its most tragic failures. Vasquez's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon and the speed of a gunfighter. She needed to arrest the aircraft's descent rate without overcorrecting and sending the F-35B bouncing back up into the chaotic air above the ship. The engines were already at maximum power, producing over 40,000 pounds of vertical thrust, but physics demanded perfect timing. At 3 feet above the deck, she could see her own reflection in the water streaming across the steel surface. The aircraft's downwash was creating a hurricane of spray and turbulence, turning the already chaotic deck environment into something resembling the surface of an alien planet. Chief Rodriguez and his deck crew were pressed flat against the superstructure, fighting just to remain standing in the 100-mile-per-hour winds created by the F-35B's engines. 2 feet, 1 foot, 6 inches. The main landing gear made contact with the deck with a sound like a thunderclap, but contact wasn't the same as landing, not on a ship that was still heaving through massive swells in 40-knot winds. The F-35B hit the deck hard, bounced back up 2 feet, then slammed down again as the ship's motion tried to throw the aircraft back into the air. Vasquez immediately cut power to the vertical thrust systems and activated the aircraft's deck locks, specialized systems that would help anchor the F-35B to the ship's deck. But even as she went through the shutdown procedures, she could feel the aircraft sliding sideways across the wet steel surface. "Chocks and chains! Chocks and chains!" Chief Rodriguez screamed over the wind, and his deck crew sprinted toward the aircraft despite the howling wind and driving rain. The next 30 seconds would be almost as dangerous as the landing itself. Until the aircraft was properly secured to the deck with chains and wheel chocks, it was essentially a 30,000-pound projectile that could slide across the deck and over the side at any moment. The deck crew had to get safety equipment in place while the ship continued to pitch and roll through violent seas. Petty Officer Jenkins, a veteran deck handler with 15 years of carrier operations, grabbed the first set of wheel chocks and sprinted toward the F-35B's main landing gear. The wind was so strong that he had to lean forward at a 45-degree angle just to make progress, and the rain was hitting with such force that it felt like being pelted with small rocks. As he reached the aircraft, the ship took a particularly violent roll to starboard. Jenkins felt his feet slip on the wet deck, and for a terrifying moment, he was sliding toward the ship's edge with nothing to stop his momentum. He managed to grab one of the F-35B's landing gear struts, using the aircraft itself as an anchor point while the ship completed its roll. Meanwhile, Vasquez was running through her post-landing checklist, but she could feel the aircraft moving beneath her. The deck locks were engaged, but they were designed to handle normal shipboard motion, not the extreme conditions they were experiencing. Every few seconds, she felt the aircraft shift as the ship's motion overcame the grip of the landing gear on the wet steel deck. "Aircraft secured!" Chief Rodriguez finally called over the radio, and Vasquez felt a wave of relief wash over her that was almost overwhelming. She had done it. She had achieved something that every expert had said was impossible, landing a vertical takeoff fighter on a moving destroyer in storm conditions that would have grounded any other aircraft. But the celebration was premature. "Lightning II-7, we have a problem," came the voice of Admiral Chen from the ship's bridge. "We're tracking the downed pilot's emergency beacon. It's fading fast. We estimate Lieutenant Morrison has maybe 2 hours before hypothermia becomes irreversible. Weather conditions are actually getting worse, not better." Vasquez looked at her fuel gauges. The aircraft had less than 100 pounds of fuel remaining, not nearly enough for another search mission. She would need to refuel and rearm, but doing so in these conditions would be extraordinarily dangerous. Normally, aircraft refueling was done in calm conditions, with the ship steaming steadily into the wind. But there was nothing normal about any of this. The refueling process would require deck crews to connect fuel lines to the aircraft while it remained chained to the deck. Jet fuel, under high pressure, electrical connections, and storm conditions created the potential for catastrophic fire or explosion. One spark, one mechanical failure, one moment of inattention could turn the flight deck into an inferno. But without refueling, there would be no rescue mission. Lieutenant Morrison, floating somewhere in the churning seas, would die of exposure while they sat safely aboard the ship. "Admiral," Vasquez's voice came over the radio, steady and professional despite the exhaustion she was feeling. "Request permission to conduct emergency refueling operations. I can be ready for launch in 30 minutes. There was a long pause before Admiral Chen responded. She was weighing the risks, conducting flight operations in conditions that were beyond the envelope of safe operations, gambling the lives of her crew against the life of one downed pilot. But deep down, she knew there was really no choice. The Navy's creed was clear: leave no one behind. Permission granted, Lightning II. We'll get you refueled and back in the air. Morrison is counting on us. As the deck crew prepared for the most dangerous refueling operation in naval history, everyone aboard the USS Wasp understood that they were about to push the boundaries of what was possible even further. The first landing was called impossible, but what they were about to attempt next would redefine the very meaning of that word. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Lieutenant Morrison's time was running out, and they were about to risk everything on a rescue mission that existed far beyond the limits of safe naval aviation operations. But sometimes, when lives hang on the balance, impossible becomes the only option left.
Admiral Chen stared at the weather display in the USS Wasp's Combat Information Center, her mind racing through the impossible calculus of command decisions. The storm wasn't weakening. If anything, Typhoon Omega was intensifying. Satellite imagery showed the eye wall contracting, a sign that the storm was becoming more compact and more violent. Wind speeds at the storm center had increased to over 130 miles per hour, with wave heights approaching 40 feet. But somewhere in that maelstrom, Lieutenant Morrison was fighting for his life. "Admiral," came the voice of the ship's meteorologist, Lieutenant Commander Park. "We're tracking Morrison's last known position based on his emergency beacon transmissions. The drift patterns show he's being carried deeper into the storm system. If we don't reach him within the next 90 minutes, the search area will become so large that even with perfect weather, we'd never find him." The mathematics of search and rescue were brutal. Every minute that passed expanded the potential search area exponentially. Morrison could be anywhere within a circle whose radius grew by hundreds of yards every minute, driven by wind and current in patterns that were impossible to predict with perfect accuracy. Time wasn't just running out, it was accelerating away from them. "What's the status on alternative rescue assets?" Admiral Chen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Ma'am, every search and rescue helicopter within 300 miles has been grounded. The Coast Guard's long-range aircraft can't operate in these conditions. We've contacted the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, but their closest available aircraft is 8 hours away, and they're reporting the same weather constraints we are." Admiral Chen closed her eyes and made the decision that would either save 3 lives or cost them all. "Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, you are authorized for emergency refueling operations. We'll have you back in the air in 20 minutes. What happened next was a masterclass in naval aviation logistics under impossible conditions. Emergency refueling on a ship in heavy seas required a choreographed dance between aircraft systems, fuel handling equipment, and human courage that bordered on the superhuman. Chief Petty Officer Martinez, the ship's lead aviation fuel specialist, had been watching the weather conditions with growing concern. In normal operations, aircraft refueling was conducted with the ship in calm seas, preferably at night when wind conditions were typically lighter, but nothing about this operation was normal. The refueling process began with connecting heavy fuel lines from the ship's aviation fuel system to the F-35B's fuel ports. These lines carried jet fuel under high pressure. A single failure could spray thousands of gallons of highly flammable fuel across the flight deck in conditions where static electricity from the storm could provide ignition. All personnel not involved in refueling operations clear the flight deck immediately. This is not a drill. Emergency refueling operations in progress. Chief Martinez and his team of 6 specialists approached the F-35B carrying the heavy fuel lines. Each line weighed over 50 pounds and had to be connected to specific ports on the aircraft with perfect precision. One wrong connection could contaminate fuel systems, or worse, create a leak that would turn the entire flight deck into a fire hazard. But the ship's violent motion made even simple tasks extraordinarily difficult. As Martinez reached for the F-35B's fuel port, the ship rolled 15 degrees to port, causing him to stumble and nearly drop the heavy fuel line. The aircraft itself was straining against its deck chains, sliding several inches back and forth as the ship pitched through the massive swells. "Connection 1 secure," Martinez called over his headset, moving to portside fuel port. The second fuel connection was on the opposite side of the aircraft, requiring the fuel team to work around the F-35B's engine intakes and exhaust ports. Even shut down, the aircraft's engine components were still hot enough to cause severe burns, and the wind from the storm was creating unpredictable air currents around the aircraft that could easily knock a person off balance.
As Martinez worked to secure the second fuel connection, Petty Officer Johnson was monitoring the fuel flow rates from the ship's fuel control station. The gauges showed normal pressure and flow, but he was watching for any sign of leakage or system malfunction that could turn the refueling operation into a catastrophe. Fuel flow established, pressure nominal, estimate 12 minutes to full tanks. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. Every minute the refueling operation continued was another minute of exposure to the storm's violence, another opportunity for something to go catastrophically wrong. The fuel lines were being whipped by 60-knot winds, creating tremendous stress on the connections. The aircraft was constantly moving against its restraints, putting additional strain on the fuel system. In the cockpit, Vasquez was conducting her pre-flight checklist for the second time in one day, but this time with the added stress of knowing that her previous impossible landing would look routine compared to what she was about to attempt. The second launch would require her to take off from a moving platform in storm conditions, conduct a search and rescue operation in weather that was beyond the F-35B's normal operating envelope, and then somehow find and rescue a pilot who might already be unconscious from hypothermia. But perhaps most challenging of all, she would eventually have to land back on the ship again in conditions that would almost certainly be even worse than her first approach. Lightning II, fuel at 90%, came the call from the fuel team. Roger, requesting armament status. In addition to fuel, the F-35B would need to carry search and rescue equipment. The aircraft's internal weapons bay had been reconfigured to carry a rescue pod, a specialized container holding a raft, emergency medical supplies, and survival gear that could be dropped to Morrison's location if they found him in the churning seas. The armament loading was almost as dangerous as the refueling. Ordnance specialists had to work around the aircraft in the storm conditions, loading equipment that would be Morrison's only hope of survival if they located him in the churning seas. Armament loading complete, rescue pod secured in internal bay. Fuel at 100%, all connections secure. Chief Martinez began the delicate process of disconnecting the fuel lines while the ship continued to pitch and roll through the storm. Each connection had to be properly secured and stowed to prevent fuel leaks or loose equipment that could become projectiles in the high winds. All fuel lines disconnected and secured, aircraft ready for launch operations. Vasquez felt her heart rate increase as she prepared for what might be the most challenging flight of her career.
The second takeoff was, in many ways, more challenging than the landing had been. During the approach, Vasquez had been able to see the ship and judge its motion relative to her aircraft, but for takeoff, she would be launching from a platform that was moving unpredictably in 3 dimensions, with no visual reference points to guide her except the horizon, which was often obscured by rain and spray. Lightning II request takeoff clearance, Vasquez transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Lightning II cleared for takeoff, winds 60 knots, gusting to 75. Be advised, we're tracking another intense weather cell approaching from the northwest. Recommend immediate departure if you're going. Admiral Chen watched from the bridge as the F-35B prepared for vertical takeoff. The aircraft looked incredibly small against the massive backdrop of the storm, a technological marvel about to challenge the fundamental forces of nature. She had authorized this mission knowing that it violated every safety protocol in naval aviation, but also knowing that without it, Lieutenant Morrison would certainly die. The vertical takeoff sequence for the F-35B was the reverse of the landing process, but no less complex. Vasquez had to transition the aircraft from a stationary platform to stable hover flight, then gradually convert from vertical thrust to forward flight while dealing with the ship's motion and the storm's turbulence. Beginning engine start sequence. The massive F-135 engine spun up to full power, creating a column of superheated exhaust that turned raindrops into steam instantly. The lift fan behind the cockpit began its acceleration to maximum RPM, and the roll posts under the wings activated. Within seconds, the F-35B was generating over 40,000 pounds of vertical thrust, enough to lift the aircraft and its full fuel load straight up from the ship's deck. But generating thrust was only half the challenge. The other half was controlling it. As soon as the aircraft lifted off the deck, it was at the mercy of the storm's chaotic air currents. The ship's superstructure created wind shadows and turbulent eddies that grabbed at the F-35B like invisible hands. 60-knot winds tried to push the aircraft sideways, while updrafts and downdrafts caused sudden altitude changes that required immediate correction. Positive rate of climb, transitioning to forward flight.
This was the most dangerous part of the takeoff sequence. As Vasquez began the transition from hover mode to conventional flight, the aircraft passed through the same commitment zone that had made her landing so treacherous. For nearly a minute, the F-35B would be neither fish nor fowl, too slow to fly conventionally, but not yet stable in hover mode. The transition required precise coordination between the main engine thrust vector, the lift fan, and the roll posts. Too much forward thrust and the aircraft would accelerate too quickly, potentially stalling the wings. Too little, and the aircraft would fall back toward the ship with potentially catastrophic results. At 200 feet above the ship, still climbing through the transition, a massive gust of wind caught the F-35B from the side. The aircraft lurched 30 feet laterally in less than 2 seconds, directly toward the ship's radar mast. Vasquez instantly corrected, applying full opposite thrust and simultaneously adjusting the main engine vector. The aircraft missed the radar mast by less than 20 feet. "Holy shit!" came an unauthorized transmission from someone on the ship, probably one of the deck crew who had witnessed the near collision. "Lightning II, you're clear of the ship. Recommend heading 090 to the search area." Vasquez was finally in conventional flight mode, but her challenges were just beginning. She now had to fly a search pattern in weather conditions that were beyond anything the F-35B had been designed to handle, looking for a single person in an ocean that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The search area was defined by Morrison's last known position and the estimated drift patterns based on wind and current data. But in storm conditions like these, those estimates were educated guesses at best. Morrison could be anywhere within a 50-square-mile area, floating in a one-man life raft that would be nearly impossible to spot even in perfect conditions. Lightning II, be advised, Morrison's emergency beacon signal is getting weaker. We estimate he has maybe 60 minutes of consciousness remaining before hypothermia becomes irreversible. The medical facts were grim. In water temperatures around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, survival time was measured in hours, not days. But Morrison had been in the water for nearly 6 hours already. Even if he wasn't a life raft and wearing a survival suit, his core body temperature would be dropping steadily. Once hypothermia set in, he would lose the ability to signal for help or even remain conscious. Vasquez began her search pattern at 300 feet above the water, low enough to have a chance of spotting Morrison, but high enough to avoid the worst of the turbulence created by the massive waves. The visibility was terrible, maybe half a mile in the driving rain, but she had to cover as much area as possible in the limited time available. The F-35B's advanced sensor systems helped somewhat. The aircraft's electro-optical targeting system could see through rain and spray better than the human eye, and its radar could detect objects as small as a life raft even in heavy seas. But the sensors were designed for military targets, not search and rescue operations, and the storm was creating false returns and interference that made interpretation difficult. Lightning II, any contact? Negative contact, beginning second search leg. The systematic search pattern was mind-numbing work, requiring absolute concentration despite the aircraft's constant buffeting by wind and turbulence. Each search leg covered about 2 miles, and Vasquez had to fly precise headings and timing to ensure complete coverage of the search area. But as she completed her third search leg with no sign of Morrison, a terrible realization began to set in. The search area was simply too large, the conditions too difficult, and time was running out too quickly. 40 minutes into the search, Lieutenant Commander Vasquez had covered nearly 30 square miles of churning ocean with no sign of Lieutenant Morrison. Her fuel was at 70%, still plenty for the search operation, but she had to keep in mind that she would eventually need enough fuel to make it back to the USS Wasp and attempt another landing in conditions that showed no signs of improving. The mathematical reality of search and rescue was working against her. Even in perfect conditions with unlimited visibility, finding a single person in the ocean was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But these weren't perfect conditions. They were as far from perfect as conditions could be while still allowing flight operations at all. "Lightning II, how's your search going?" came the voice of Admiral Chen from the ship. "No contact yet, Admiral. Visibility is less than half a mile, and I'm getting a lot of false returns from wave action. If Morrison is conscious and able to deploy signaling devices, I should be able to spot him, but if he's hypothermic and unable to signal..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone involved in the operation understood the implications. Vasquez was flying her search pattern at the absolute limits of the F-35B's capabilities. The aircraft was designed for combat operations, not low-level flight in extreme weather conditions. Every few seconds, a particularly violent gust would drop the aircraft 50 feet or throw it sideways, requiring immediate correction to maintain the search altitude and heading. The constant turbulence was also taking a physical toll. Flying in these conditions required continuous control inputs to keep the aircraft stable, and Vasquez could feel the fatigue building in her arms and shoulders. Her flight suit was soaked with perspiration, despite the cool air conditioning, and her hands were cramping from gripping the control stick so tightly. But somewhere down there, Lieutenant Morrison was counting on her. The breakthrough came during her fifth search leg. In an area that was technically outside the predicted drift pattern, Vasquez had decided to expand the search area based on her own intuition about how the storm currents might be affecting Morrison's position. At first, it was just a brief glint of something reflective on the water's surface, visible for maybe 2 seconds through a break in the rain. It could have been anything: debris from a ship, a piece of floating garbage, or just the way sunlight reflected off a wave crest. But something about it looked wrong. Too geometric. Too bright. Lightning II, possible contact bearing 045, range approximately 2 miles, Vasquez transmitted, banking the F-35B toward the sighting. She approached the area carefully, flying a tight spiral pattern that would allow her to examine the contact from multiple angles. The ocean surface was a chaos of white caps and spray, but there, a flash of orange against the gray water. A life raft. Contact! Contact! I have visual on a life raft bearing 047 degrees, range 1 mile from my current position. The relief in her voice was audible to everyone listening to the radio frequency. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, she had found Morrison. But finding him and rescuing him were 2 very different challenges. Vasquez descended to 100 feet to a closer look at the life raft. It was being tossed around like a cork in a bathtub, rising and falling through 20-foot wave crests. She could see a figure inside the raft. Morrison was alive, or at least had been when he deployed the raft. But there was no way to land the F-35B on the water to conduct a rescue. The aircraft had no amphibious capability, and even if it did, landing on 20-foot swells in 60-knot winds would be suicide. The rescue would have to be conducted using the emergency equipment she was carrying. Lightning II, what's Morrison's condition? Admiral Chen's voice crackled through the radio. I can see movement in the life raft, but I can't tell his exact condition from this altitude. I'm going to drop the rescue pod and see if I can establish communication. The rescue pod drop was almost as complex as the landing and takeoff operations had been. The pod contained survival equipment, medical supplies, and most importantly, a radio that Morrison could use to communicate with both the aircraft and the ship. But dropping it accurately to a small life raft in heavy seas required precision that bordered on the impossible. Vasquez positioned the F-35B upwind of Morrison's position, calculating the trajectory needed to account for wind drift during the pod's fall. The pod would take about 15 seconds to reach the water from her current altitude, and during that time, it would be blown off course by the 60-knot winds. Rescue pod away. The pod fell through the turbulent air, its small parachute deploying automatically at 500 feet. She watched through her targeting system as the pod drifted toward Morrison's life raft, but the wind was stronger than she had calculated. The pod splashed down about 50 yards away from Morrison, close enough for him to reach if he was conscious and strong enough to swim, but too far if he was already incapacitated by hypothermia. For several agonizing minutes, there was no movement from the life raft. Then, slowly, Vasquez saw Morrison beginning to paddle toward the rescue pod. He was alive and conscious, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. Classic signs of hypothermia setting in. "Come on, Morrison," she whispered into her helmet. "You can do it!" It took him nearly 10 minutes to reach the rescue pod, time during which Vasquez circled overhead, maintaining visual contact while monitoring her fuel levels. She was now at 50% fuel. Still sufficient for the return flight, but the margin for error was shrinking. Finally, Morrison managed to haul the rescue pod into his life raft. A few minutes later, his voice came through the radio, weak but clear. Lightning 2-7, this is Reaper 1-3. Thanks for the delivery. I'm cold as hell, but still breathing.
The sound of Lieutenant Morrison's voice over the radio was one of the most beautiful things Lieutenant Commander Vasquez had ever heard. After nearly 7 hours in the water, fighting hypothermia and exhaustion, Morrison was alive and conscious. But getting him to safety would require one more seemingly impossible feat. Reaper 1-3, this is Lightning 2-7. Good to hear your voice. What's your condition? I'm pretty cold, and my hands aren't working too well, but I'm functional. The survival suit kept me mostly dry, and the life raft is holding up okay. But I don't think I can last much longer in these conditions. Morrison's voice, while reassuring, carried the telltale signs of hypothermia: slurred words, slower speech patterns, and the kind of forced cheerfulness that comes from someone fighting to maintain consciousness. The medical supplies in the rescue pod would help, but what Morrison really needed was immediate evacuation to the ship's medical facilities. The problem was that the USS Wasp had no helicopter capability in these conditions. The ship's search and rescue helicopters had been secured below decks hours earlier when wind conditions exceeded their operating limits. Even if they could be launched, landing a helicopter on the ship in 60-knot winds would be just as dangerous as what Vasquez had already accomplished. Which left only one option. Morrison would have to be rescued by the same F-35B that had found him. Admiral, I need to discuss rescue options, Vasquez transmitted on a discreet frequency. Go ahead, Lightning 2-7. Morrison is alive and conscious, but he's showing signs of hypothermia. We need to get him out of the water immediately. I'm thinking we might be able to rig up a rescue sling and haul him up to the aircraft. There was a long pause before Admiral Chen responded. What Vasquez was suggesting had never been attempted before. The F-35B had no built-in rescue winch system like search and rescue helicopters. They would have to improvise using equipment that was never designed for this purpose. Lightning 2-7, that's extremely dangerous. You'd have to maintain perfect hover in these conditions while Morrison attaches himself to a line. One mistake and either he falls back into the water or you lose control of the aircraft. Admiral, with respect, do we have any other options? Another pause. Negative. No other options. The improvised rescue system would use the F-35B's external cargo hook, normally used for carrying underslung loads, connected to a rescue harness from the emergency pod. Morrison would have to put on the harness, attach it to a line lowered from the aircraft, and then trust that Vasquez could maintain stable hover while lifting him out of the life raft. In calm conditions, it would be challenging. In a typhoon, it was borderline insane. Reaper 1-3. We're going to try something that's never been done before. I need you to put on the rescue harness from the pod and prepare for extraction. Roger, Lightning 2-7. How exactly is this going to work? Vasquez explained the plan while she positioned the F-35B for the rescue attempt. She would have to transition back to hover mode directly over Morrison's life raft, lower the extraction line, wait for him to connect it to his harness, then lift him out of the water while simultaneously flying the aircraft back to the ship. Each phase of the operation was fraught with danger. During hover, the aircraft would be at its most vulnerable to wind gusts and turbulence. Morrison would be dangling beneath the aircraft on a thin cable, completely dependent on Vasquez's ability to maintain control. And the flight back to the ship would require her to fly a precision approach while managing both the aircraft and a human being suspended beneath it. Transitioning to hover mode over your position. Vasquez began the complex process of slowing the F-35B from forward flight to stationary hover. As she had learned during her earlier landing approach, hover flight in these conditions was like trying to balance on a tightrope during an earthquake. Every gust of wind translated to immediate aircraft movement, and the closer she got to the water surface, the more turbulent the air became.
"50 feet above you, deploying rescue line." The line dropped from the F-35B's cargo hook, weighted to help it cut through the wind, but even with the weight, the line was being whipped around by the 60-knot winds, making it nearly impossible for Morrison to grab. It took him 3 attempts to catch the line, and by that time, Vasquez was fighting to maintain position over the life raft. The aircraft wanted to drift with the wind, and she was making constant control inputs to stay centered over Morrison's position. "Got the line, connecting harness." Morrison's movements were sluggish from hypothermia, but he managed to connect the harness to the line. The connection was secure, but now came the most dangerous part of the operation, lifting him out of the relative safety of the life raft and suspending him beneath the aircraft. "Connected and ready for lift." "Roger, beginning extraction. Hold on tight." Vasquez gradually added collective, lifting Morrison out of the life raft and into the full fury of the storm. The additional weight changed the aircraft's handling characteristics, requiring her to make immediate adjustments to maintain stable flight. Worse, Morrison's body acted like a sail in the 60-knot winds, creating a pendulum effect that threatened to destabilize the entire aircraft. "Lightning II-7, I'm getting pretty banged around down here." Morrison's voice was strained as he fought to maintain his grip on the harness. "Hang tight, we're going home." Now came the final challenge, flying back to the USS Wasp while maintaining control of both the aircraft and Morrison suspended beneath it, then somehow managing to land safely on the ship's pitching deck. What happened next would test the absolute limits of human skill and technological capability. The flight back to the USS Wasp with Lieutenant Morrison suspended beneath the F-35B was unlike anything in the history of naval aviation. Vasquez was essentially flying 2 aircraft simultaneously, the F-35B itself and Morrison's body, which acted as an unpredictable pendulum swinging through the storm winds at the end of a 50-foot cable. Every gust of wind that hit Morrison's body translated directly into the aircraft's flight controls. When he swung forward, the F-35B's nose pitched down. When he swung aft, the tail dropped. Side-to-side movements tried to roll the aircraft beyond its ability to compensate. Vasquez was fighting a constant battle to maintain controlled flight, while Morrison was buffeted by winds that would have knocked a standing person flat. "Lightning II-7, how are you managing the load?" Admiral Chen's voice came through the radio, tense with concern. "It's like flying with a 200-pound windsock attached to the bottom of the aircraft," Vasquez replied, her voice strained from the physical effort of controlling the aircraft. "Morrison's body is acting like a sail, and every wind gust tries to throw us off course." Below her, Morrison was experiencing his own nightmare. Suspended 50 feet beneath the aircraft in a rescue harness, he was being whipped through the air at speeds that sometimes exceeded 80 miles per hour. The storm winds grabbed at his body from every direction, spinning him like a leaf while he fought to maintain his grip on the harness straps. "Lightning II-7, I'm getting pretty dizzy down here," Morrison transmitted, his voice showing signs of severe stress. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The harness was designed for helicopter rescues, where the victim would typically be lifted straight up and quickly brought inside the aircraft. But the F-35B had no cabin space for passengers, and Morrison would have to remain suspended beneath the aircraft for the entire flight back to the ship, nearly 20 minutes, in conditions that were testing both human endurance and mechanical systems far beyond their design limits. Vasquez was also fighting her own battle against exhaustion. She had been flying for nearly 2 hours in conditions that would normally ground all aircraft. Her flight suit was soaked with perspiration, her hands were cramping from maintaining a death grip on the controls, and the constant turbulence was creating a level of stress that few pilots ever experienced. But she couldn't afford to make even the smallest mistake. Morrison's life was literally hanging by a thread, or more precisely, by a steel cable that was being stressed far beyond its normal operating parameters. "Wasp, Lightning II-7, 5 miles out. Request immediate recovery operations." "Roger, Lightning II-7. Be advised, conditions have not improved. Winds are now 65 knots, gusting to 80 knots.
We're experiencing deck motion of plus-minus 35 feet. The conditions were actually getting worse, not better. The Typhoon's eye wall was moving closer to their position, bringing with it the most violent winds of the entire storm system. What had been merely impossible an hour ago was now entering the realm of the physically inconceivable. But they were committed. Morrison couldn't survive much longer suspended in the storm, and Vasquez didn't have enough fuel for another attempt. This landing had to work, or they would both be lost. Lightning II-7, 5 miles out. Request immediate recovery. Roger, Lightning II-7. Be advised, conditions have not improved. Winds are now 6.5 knots, gusting to 80 knots. We're experiencing deck motion of plus-minus 35 feet. This approach would be different from her earlier landing in every possible way. Instead of a clean aircraft with predictable flight characteristics, she was flying what amounted to an experimental configuration that had never been tested. The pendulum effect from Morrison's suspended body changed the aircraft's center of gravity, altered its response to control inputs, and created aerodynamic forces that the F-35B's flight control computers had never been programmed to handle. Worse, she couldn't see Morrison during the approach. He was suspended directly beneath the aircraft in her blind spot, being whipped around by winds that were now approaching hurricane force. She had no way of knowing if he was still conscious, still holding onto the harness, or even still alive. 1 mile out, visual on the ship. The USS Wasp looked like a toy boat being shaken by an angry giant. The flight deck was rising and falling through a 40-foot range every few seconds, while simultaneously rolling back and forth through angles that seemed impossible for a ship to survive. Landing on that moving target while managing Morrison's suspended body would require a level of precision that was beyond human capability. But human capability was all they had left. Half-mile out, beginning transition to hover mode. The transition was even more violent than before. As the F-35B slowed from forward flight to hover, Morrison's body swung forward beneath the aircraft like a massive pendulum. The sudden change in the aircraft's center of gravity caused the nose to pitch down violently, requiring Vasquez to make an immediate full aft control input to prevent the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable dive. "Jesus!" Morrison's voice came through the radio as he was whipped forward and then snapped back like a bungee jumper. "Sorry, hold on tight, we're almost there." The ship's landing signal officer, Chief Rodriguez, could see the F-35B approaching through the storm, and what he saw defied belief. The aircraft was flying in a completely unstable manner, pitching and rolling through angles that should have resulted in loss of control. But somehow Vasquez was maintaining just enough stability to continue the approach. "Lightning II-7, you're completely out of the envelope for safe recovery operations," Rodriguez transmitted. "Negative." Vasquez cut him off. "We're committed. Morrison can't take another approach." She was right. Morrison had been suspended in the hurricane force winds for nearly 15 minutes, his body temperature dropping rapidly despite the survival suit. The harness was designed for short-duration lifts, not extended flight operations, and the straps were cutting into his body with every movement. At 200 feet above the USS Wasp's flight deck, with Morrison suspended beneath her aircraft like a human pendulum in the hurricane, Lieutenant Commander Vasquez began the most challenging approach of her career. Everything about the situation violated basic principles of safe flight operations, but safe flight operations had been abandoned hours ago. The ship's motion was so violent that the flight deck disappeared completely behind walls of spray for seconds at a time. When it reappeared, it was never where she expected it to be. The mathematical precision required to land on a moving target had been replaced by pure instinct and reflexes honed through thousands of hours of flight experience. 100 feet. Looking... Well, we're still flying, Rodriguez called from his position on the ship. His normal landing signal officer calls had been replaced by a mixture of encouragement and amazement that the aircraft was still in controlled flight at all.
Morrison, suspended beneath the aircraft, could see the ship's deck rushing toward him at an alarming rate. From his perspective, dangling at the end of a cable in 80-knot winds, he felt more like a human wrecking ball than a rescued pilot. Every movement of the F-35B translated into wild gyrations that threatened to tear the harness from his body or knock him unconscious against the aircraft's fuselage. 50 feet, Morrison still looks secure, Rodriguez called, though he could barely see the suspended figure through the driving rain and spray. Vasquez was now flying almost entirely by feel. The aircraft's instruments were giving readings that conflicted with her inner ear. The flight control computers were struggling to process inputs from sensors that were being confused by the extreme conditions. And the normal visual cues that pilots relied on for landing had been replaced by chaos and motion. But somehow, through a combination of skill, determination, and what could only be described as aviation magic, she was still maintaining some semblance of controlled flight. 25 feet, deck moving plus minus 40 feet, winds 85 knots. This was it. At 25 feet, she was committed to the landing whether the deck was ready for her or not. Morrison was suspended just 10 feet above the wildly moving steel surface, close enough to be killed instantly if the aircraft lost control. The next 10 seconds unfolded in slow motion, though they actually happened faster than human reaction time normally allowed. The ship's deck rose to meet Morrison's feet just as a massive gust of wind caught the F-35B from the side. The aircraft lurched 30 feet laterally in less than 2 seconds, directly toward the ship's superstructure. Morrison's feet touched the deck, just as Vasquez applied full lateral thrust to push the aircraft away from the ship's radar mast. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Morrison was running along the pitching deck while still connected to the aircraft above, like a water skier being pulled by an airplane. "Disconnect! Disconnect!" Chief Rodriguez screamed over the radio. Morrison's hands, numb from cold and exhaustion, fumbled with the harness release mechanism. The quick release was designed to be operated with one hand in emergency situations, but his fingers weren't responding properly to commands from his hypothermic brain. Finally, the release mechanism clicked open. Morrison collapsed onto the deck just as the ship took a massive roll to starboard. Instantly, deck crew members who had been waiting with safety lines sprinted toward him, fighting against winds that were now approaching 100 miles per hour. They had seconds to get Morrison secured before the ship's motion threw him overboard. But Vasquez's ordeal wasn't over. She still had to land the F-35B on the moving deck. And now she was flying an aircraft that had been stressed far beyond its design limits. The engines had been running at maximum power for nearly 3 hours. The flight control systems had been making constant corrections for conditions that exceeded their programming parameters, and every system on the aircraft was operating in the red zone. Lightning II-7, cleared to land, and for God's sakes, be careful. The landing was almost anticlimactic after everything that had come before. Vasquez brought the F-35B down to the deck with the kind of precision that comes only from having pushed human skill and technological capability beyond their theoretical limits. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the pitching deck as the deck crew rushed forward with chains and chocks. "Aircraft on deck, aircraft secured," Chief Rodriguez called over the radio, and for the first time in hours, there was genuine relief in his voice. Vasquez sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still gripping the controls, unable to quite believe that she had accomplished what every expert had said was impossible. She had landed an F-35B on a moving destroyer in hurricane conditions, taken off again in even worse weather, conducted a search and rescue operation that had never been attempted before, and then returned to land successfully with a human being suspended beneath her aircraft. But the full magnitude of what had been accomplished wouldn't become clear until much later. Lieutenant Morrison was rushed to the ship's medical bay, where the medical team worked to reverse the effects of hypothermia and treat the injuries he had sustained during the rescue operation. He would make a full recovery, and 6 months later, he would return to flight status with a story that would be told and retold in aviation circles for generations to come. The F-35B Lightning II, tail number 168318, was thoroughly inspected by maintenance teams and found to have suffered no permanent damage despite the extreme conditions it had endured. The aircraft would go on to fly hundreds more missions, but none would ever match the drama and impossibility of that day in the Philippine Sea. Admiral Chen's official report of the incident would run to over 50 pages and would be classified at the highest levels of the naval sea. The techniques developed during the rescue operation would be incorporated into new training programs for F-35B pilots, and the lessons learned would influence the design of future vertical landing aircraft. But perhaps most importantly, the story would become legend within the naval aviation community, proof that when human skill, technological capability, and sheer determination are combined in exactly the right proportions, even the impossible becomes achievable. 3 days later, when Typhoon Omega finally dissipated and the seas returned to normal, Lieutenant Commander Maria Vasquez was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. During the medal ceremony, Admiral Chen would say that she had witnessed something that day that redefined her understanding of what was possible in military aviation. The Admiral said impossible until Lieutenant Commander Vasquez proved that impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been done yet. The rescue operation would be studied at the Naval War College, analyzed by aerospace engineers, and documented in classified reports that would influence military aviation doctrine for decades to come. But for those who were there that day, watching through the storm as an F-35B defied every law of physics and common sense to save a fellow pilot's life, no analysis or documentation could capture the true magnitude of what they had witnessed. It was a moment when human courage and technological capability combined to achieve something that existed at the very edge of possibility. A reminder that in the most desperate circumstances, when everything seems lost and the experts say it can't be done, sometimes the only thing standing between success and failure is the willingness to try anyway. The storm that had seemed like an insurmountable enemy had become the backdrop for one of the greatest achievements in naval aviation history. And somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, the waves that had threatened to claim 2 lives now rolled peacefully under clear skies, carrying with them the memory of the day when impossible became inevitable. Years later, when military historians would write about the evolution of naval aviation, they would mark this rescue operation as a turning point. The moment that the theoretical capabilities of vertical landing fighter aircraft were proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But for Lieutenant Commander Maria Vasquez, it would always be remembered more simply, as the day she refused to accept that saving a fellow pilot was impossible, and in refusing to accept it, made it possible. The story of the F-35B that landed on a moving destroyer in 40-knot winds would be told and retold, inspiring a new generation of naval aviators to push the boundaries of what was considered achievable. And every time the story was told, it would end the same way, with the understanding that in the face of the impossible, sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to give up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.